And welcome to another edition of the On Mission with Proclaim Cuba podcast. This show this year invites people to share stories of how they embrace Cuba. That's our theme for 2024. And as our guests share their roles of embracing the four pillars of ministry, it's evangelism, discipleship, training, and community support, we hope you will reflect on God's hand at work in the past, see His provision in the present, and visualize His transforming plan for the future. Hello, I'm your host, Andrew Wishmeyer, one of the team members here at Proclaim Cuba. Today on the show, we have a special guest who's had a personal connection with Cuba for as long as she can remember. She's also the latest member to join our team. I'm very excited to welcome today Caroline Pino. Caroline, we are really thrilled that you are with us today on the program. And so one of the first things that I always ask folks is to give us a little bit of their background, tell us about their family, and then their church family.
Well, like you said, my name's Caroline. I was raised in Dallas, Texas. Went to school here through high school, and then I went to the University of Texas and got my undergraduate degree there. I then migrated my way back to Dallas, and I got my graduate degree in marketing and stayed just close to my family. I found a wonderful church family called Stonegate Church. They're in Midlothian, which is a little bit outside of the Metroplex. Some people don't necessarily know where that is, but south of the Metroplex. And yeah, my church family is absolutely wonderful. They're great friends. They're great gospel community around me, and they've embraced me and loved me. And yeah, I found great friendship and great family here at my church.
That's really great. So we welcomed you into a new role, and so I'm going to let you tell us a little bit about how you came into that role and what you'll be doing for us.
Yeah, kind of a funny story. I feel like I've been doing work with Proclaim Cuba. Well, I have been doing work with Proclaim Cuba for the last few years, just as an outside freelancer, running all of the communications that people might have seen. If you follow us on social media, shameless plug at Proclaim Cuba on all of our social medias, then my team and I were working on all of that content for the past couple of years. And I just felt the Lord calling me out of doing freelancing and kind of being my own boss and to be under the headship and under the leadership of somebody else. And I didn't know really what that role might look like. I thought about maybe approaching my church family, seeing if there was a role in ministry there. And then I also loved the work that I was doing with Cuba. Again, I have that personal connection to the ministry that I've loved and supported the ministry for so long. And so I thought, well, I might as well throw my ring in the basket with Proclaim Cuba and see if they'll take me on in some capacity. I always thought it would be really cool to do, donor development and see if I could start creating my own relationships with people, since I naturally just talked about Cuba in my everyday conversation, it seemed. And so I approached the team and asked if there might be a position available. And luckily, you guys welcomed me and kind of created this hybrid position where I'm still running our communications as communication specialist, but then I'm sitting underneath Andrew's tutelage as the development associate. So I've already gotten to meet with some of our wonderful partners and just hear about the heart that they have for Cuba and be encouraged by their generosity, and then be able to create new connections with people who don't know about the ministry yet. So that's kind of my role here, and I'm excited about it.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and Caroline has already she hit the ground running, and she's been fantastic so far. You've actually been to Cuba in January, didn't you?
Yes, I did go. I went on our first trip of 2024, which is so exciting just to be back in the country. I hadn't been, I think, for 2 years, which I've been to Cuba over 10 times. So a 2 year span of not going to Cuba felt like a really long time for me. And so I got to see some of the wonderful faces of our ministry leaders there in country and be on a wonderful trip where we got to bring in over 300 pounds of medical supplies, go to a pop-up clinic, see kind of a lot of our different ministry in action that's been happening over the past 2 years. So it really was hitting the ground running in January and being like, okay, you're on the team. You're going to Cuba. Get
That's
ready.
right.
So
That's
it
right.
was great.
Yeah, and we're also training you to be able to lead trips as well, which is exciting for us because we love to be able to show Cuba. Last year our theme was See Cuba. This year it's Embrace Cuba. I mean, we want to invite people to come and see the island for themselves. We really think that that's the best way for people to be able to get to know what God is doing down there, for them to be able to see that within our church family down there, within our network down there. So Caroline is going to be an integral part of that in the coming years, and we're grateful. Her natural tendency is to just connect with people. So it's a great fit in so many ways for her to be able to do that, and we just really look forward to seeing what God's going to do with all of our opportunities together, both on the communication side and then just connecting with people. So far, it's really been fantastic. So we thank you for hitting the ground running with us, Caroline. All
Thanks.
right, so let's talk a little bit about your heritage, right? You actually are Cuban by heritage, right?
I am. My grandfather was born in Cuba, my dad's father, and my grandmother migrated to Cuba. They met there. My dad was conceived in Cuba, and then my grandmother, when she was 6 months pregnant, moved to the United States. So my dad is a first generation United States citizen, but my heritage on my dad's side is part Romanian and part Cuban. So, yeah,
Always an interesting mix that we have here in the U.S. That's for sure. So
definitely, definitely.
all right. So we know that you have this heritage. So obviously, there was always talk about Cuba within your household. What got you personally interested in Cuba? When did that happen?
So, like you said, I remember Cuba always being a conversation piece, like around the dinner table. My dad would go periodically to Cuba, and I was too young, I think, to understand even what he was doing, what missions was. And I had never had any, experience with that personally until one day my dad came in, and I think it was like at dinner time, and he told us that we were going to go on a trip to Cuba that summer. And I thought in my brain, I thought, oh, it was just a vacation to Cuba, because I thought it was just like any other island. Um, and I already knew Pastor Carlos and Carly, our executive director, because they had come previously to stay in our house with us multiple times. So I kind of just thought we were going on a vacation. We were going to visit Carlos and see their house and all of the things. And little did I know that it was going to be the start of a very, very long and intentional journey that the Lord had us on. So that was in 2013, whenever my siblings and I went. To Cuba with my parents, and we visited the church that many have been to in Cespedes. And we visited with Soledad and Carlos and Carly and met kind of our OG team there in Cespedes. And we did a vacation Bible school. And, I'd been hearing at church, the church that we were going to at the time, the pastor gave a message about desperate dependence. I hadn't had much tangible evidence to that in my own life. There was nothing that I necessarily had been depending on God for to provide needs in my life. That was something that my parents luckily had always provided me with everything that I needed. But going to a church service in Cuba, being around the homes, the families in Cuba, in that tiny village, um, it showed me for the first time what desperate dependence was. And I remember looking over to my mom in the church service, and I looked at her and I said, "Do you remember what the pastor was saying a couple weeks ago at church about desperate dependence? I think that's this." I think that's this here with these people. And I was 13 at the time. Like I was a believer. I loved God, but I didn't know what real faith and real dependence on God looked like until that first year that I went to Cuba. And from then on, I mean, my outlook and my perspective on life was changed completely forever. And I wish I could say that it was a story that it totally turned my life around and I wanted to um I don't know, give all my money and I was the most generous person in the entire world. The Lord's worked on me in terms of generosity and what it looks like to be a part of his mission and support the nations. But man, for sure my outlook, just having that global perspective, was forever changed from that first year that I went to Cuba as a 13-year-old.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when God starts talking to us as a teenager. I became a believer when I was 13, and so I know what that feels like when you just start seeing some things in a different way, and how God starts stirring in your heart. It's a very powerful thing. It changed my life as well. So you've been many times to Cuba. You've seen many parts of the country. Um, you know that we have our four pillars of evangelism, discipleship, training, and community support. So, which one of those four pillars do you feel the most drawn to? Where do you feel like you're gifted, and where you want to serve the most?
I think that's a great question. I've seen our ministries come underneath those pillars in a very organic way. Um, I've obviously always been super connected to all of the creative side of everything that our leaders do in Cuba. And so I think most recently, the Lord's been putting the most on my heart is how we can train our church staff in Cuba to be able to tell stories and communicate effectively in their ministry with the people who they're trying to minister to. I was just telling a friend the other day that Cuba's always kind of 10 years behind in terms of their technology, kind of um, even just like their church structure and the organizational structure of businesses and things like that.
That's what our executive director Carly tells us. He said that they're 10 years behind. So that's not something we made up. That was something he tells us.
Well, and I think I've seen that a lot within our churches. My most recent experience, we went to a church in Havana that many have been to, Family Restoration Church. And I saw in the church, maybe probably like a 13 or 14-year-old, he was walking around taking pictures, and he had a very kind of rudimentary video camera that he was utilizing to video different B-roll of the church service, things like that. They're just starting to get access to the technology and to the tools to be able to communicate in this creative way to audiences through things like social media, because they now have access to Wi-Fi in a more accessible way, even though it's not completely accessible to them. They have access to technology, to social media platforms, all of these things. So I'd love to see over the next couple of years us to develop under our training side, and this reaches into discipleship, it reaches into evangelism, to be able to speak about God on these social media platforms, but to train our church staff and our church leaders to be able to utilize the creative elements and communications to be able to reach their congregations, to be able to reach more people inside of the island of Cuba. And then we've also seen to be able to reach outside of the island of Cuba, that we've had pastors in Cuba that have been able to go and do missions in other countries because people have seen videos of them preaching online. And that's how they heard about them. And so I would just love to see that. It's not something that we typically talk about or think about when we think about training within our ministry. We often think about training our pastors through our seminary, training future, ministry leaders in our seminary, different things like that, more spiritual training. But I think that that tangible training element also of how we can utilize communications to be able to effectively evangelize and minister to Cubans, and train our church staff in how to have that creative element, and produce those deliverables to be able to communicate and minister to people. I think it's a really, really cool concept that hasn't been available to us previously. 2 years ago, we didn't think that this was even going to be a possibility where we are now, and the access to smartphones and things like that that our Cuban leaders are getting. So the Lord's just primed us for a really cool time to be able to step in and say, okay, where is Cuba at now as a country, and how can we step in and begin to help with the tools and resources that we have, because we're kind of 10 years ahead if you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting take, and I agree with you. I mean, what do we all respond well to? What do we like to hear? And that's the stories of how God is working. And so, being able to share those in so many different ways now is fantastic. And so, I want us to utilize all kinds of different channels to be able to share with what God is doing. We know that God moves in the hearts of the people who go. We know that God is moving in Cuba. I mean, we had as we put together what we call our impact report, and Caroline was actually the one who designed that. That's now available on our website. Um, we got to tell the numbers that God has been number of people that God has been reaching in all four of those pillars, but ultimately, as we all know, it's the stories behind those numbers that we all want to hear. We want to celebrate with everybody, so we share those things. If you haven't had a chance to look at our impact report, I encourage you to go out and do that, because it really is amazing to see. It's revival level stuff that God is doing there. He is reaching so many people with his gospel and giving them a message of help and hope in Cuba. And we're just glad to be a part of it. We just come alongside our 75 churches and 200 leaders, and we help them every day to do what God has designed them to do. And Caroline's got to see that over and over and over again, which is wonderful. I always ask people what has surprised you about Cuba. So I'll pose that question to you as well. Is there anything that surprised you in Cuba, both in the past and maybe even currently on your last trip?
You know, the thing that surprised me the most about Cuba when I went initially, and I do think that this is because I was so young whenever I went initially, but man, even as an adult, as I think about the generosity of the Cuban people. Um,
Hmm.
I had a friend the other day who posed the question of, I've been to other socialist countries and they have not been very warm. The people haven't been very warm. They're kind of closed off. It's kind of this idea of like every man for himself in a way because they've been forced to think that way almost. And when they asked me, is Cuba the same way? I said, absolutely not. The Cuban people are the most warm, generous people. When I talk about a people that would give you the shirt off their back, I mean it, literally. I've witnessed time and time again while I am there, you know, the slightest thing that I could ever need or want. I have without a doubt that if I'm in Cuba, if and you're there, they're taking care of you like you're their kid, like you're their immediate family, and they might not even know
Yeah.
you. We get invited all the time whenever we're there to pastors' homes and just different leaders in our ministry, and the way that they bend over backwards to even just get a packet of crackers for all of us, to have fresh juice available for all of us. Every time we're there at a church service, I always see almost every single member of the congregation coming up to either give offerings of their daily rations that they've gotten for that day, whether it's food, and they're going and putting it in the offering basket to say, I want to give this to the neediest member of our community. Just that mindset that like there's always someone who might need more than I need. And so who am I to hoard what the Lord has given me? Well, everything that the Lord has given me, I am to give it back to him. And I have
Hmm.
never seen that in a more tangible way than in the generosity of the Cuban people.
Yeah.
And it was shocking to me as a child, and it
Hmm.
still shocks me as an adult,
Yeah.
because it's so the antithesis of how we live as just an American culture. We live in such excess that when you strip it all back, and are able to really just go and spend time in community with the Cuban people, and especially our brothers and sisters, the believers in Cuba. Um, Man, that is just made so tangible to you. And so I'm forever grateful that the Lord, even if he had had me go to Cuba and never go back, which I'm grateful that he has had me go back, but just to be able to learn and have that experience, it's one thing to hear about it on a podcast like this. And I do think that's great. It's inspirational, but it's another thing to go and see it with your own eyes,
Yeah.
and to witness it.
Yeah.
with your own eyes. And so, man, if that's the push that you need today to go and go to Cuba, you've been thinking about it, you're connected with our ministry, I would encourage you right now, contact one of us and sign up for how you can hear about a trip and see about going on a trip, because
Absolutely. We have that contact page on our website, which is proclaimcuba.org. And just go to the contact menu up there, and we'll be happy to start that conversation with you. That's amazing, Caroline. It is surprising, the hospitality. I know what that feels like. It's also very humbling to be a part of that, but it's also an incredible joy that you get to experience that, and makes you want to become more generous yourself as a result of that too. So
absolutely.
you were 13 when you went. So let's make a contrast with about how different you might be today as a result of serving in Cuba. How has God shaped that time from when you were 13 to the time that you are now?
I think going to Cuba has changed my outlook personally on what it looks like to be a leader, especially in the missional context. I think a lot of times, well, for a lot of my life, I believed that the only way that you could go on a mission trip and truly be effective was if you had some flashy gift or talent, like worship leading or teaching or something like that, to be able to go and offer to people. Or if you went and you could, give a lot of money, or you went and you had this great skill of building a house and you could build the entire house yourself. I was looking at those big kind of flashy talents and skills and thinking, Lord, how could you, I don't have any of those things, so how could you use me? But being a part of this ministry has opened up my eyes to the First Corinthians 12 idea of what it looks like in terms of spiritual gifts and how the Lord uses those, especially in a missional aspect. That the person who is sitting in the congregation on a mission trip, hugging and loving on those people who they might not even speak the same language as, but you're just there sitting, hugging, loving on them. You might be there, and one year I went and I spent 3 days organizing a supply closet, literally, and categorizing everything that was in the supply closet. I went back in January, and one of our ministry leaders brought that up and said, I don't know what we would have done, but we were at a point, because that was right before COVID happened. So they were at a point where they had supplies that they didn't even know about, but they were able to steward them because for some reason, somebody asked me, hey, can you organize this supply closet and help us count how many of each thing that we have? It was VBS supplies, so paint and markers and all of these things. Well, then we went on a 2-year span where we weren't able to get anything to them in COVID. Um, and so they knew exactly how many supplies they had. They were able to be really good stewards of it. I've seen the Lord take and use what I would think of as the smallest gift or the least impactful spiritual gift and use it for such big things in Cuba. And so, I've just seen the Lord take what I thought was leadership and just flip it on its head and say, whatever gift I have given you, you can take it on mission with you.
We're down to our final question. So uh, this is always a good one for me, because I really feel like as we have grown closer to, as our heart has grown bigger for Cuba, right? We talk about it. You talked about that before you're even on staff with us, you're talking to people about Cuba. You're inviting people to Cuba. Um, how do you do that? What is that conversation look like as you encourage people to serve? One of the things about this podcast that I always try to do is that, not everybody is called to serve in Cuba. Some people are called to serve in other ways, and that's the beauty of the body of Christ. But if you're inviting other people, if you're encouraging other people to go and serve, what does that conversation look
I think the most natural way to start a conversation in in any sense is by talking about your own personal testimony
like?
with that. So I always start with, I have great friends who will ask me, "Hey, I know you went to Cuba." Even as I invited multiple friends and took multiple friends with me to Cuba whenever I was in high school. The reason that those conversations were even started was because I was open to just talk about Cuba, tell the stories of Cuba, to my friends. that I'd gone with. So if you've been on a trip with us to Cuba, the first thing that I would say is don't be shy about talking about it. We're told to tell of the good works of the Lord to the nations, to everyone around us. And the Lord bringing you to Cuba and giving you the experience, whatever it might have consisted of, is a good work. And I think that the most natural way for you to start a conversation about that is to tell your story, and conversations and questions just naturally flow out from there. Um, I also think that in that same way, if you've been a podcast guest with us, sharing that podcast with people and just saying, "Hey, I was on this podcast and I told a cool story of a trip that I went on to Cuba um, in that podcast," and just sharing that link with people. That's a super easy way to do it. I think that a lot of people can be afraid to talk about an experience they've had because they might say, "I might not have all of the answers to the questions that people might ask me." And the reality is people don't need all of the answers. As I've grown in talking about our ministry and just talking about the Lord, the Bible in general, I've become very comfortable with saying, "Well, I don't know, but I probably know someone who I can ask."
Those are very key moments when you are willing to raise your hand and say, "Lord, send me." You don't know where He's going to send you. He may send you to the furthest part of the world. He may send you to Cuba. He may send you to your neighbor. You just don't know. We all have different places that we are going to serve, and but wherever that is, God has a purpose for that, right, within the body of Christ. And so we're grateful to be able to do that. Sometimes we have people who are connected to us who don't necessarily have the draw to go to Cuba, but there are many opportunities to be able to support us. They feel drawn to support us. You may feel drawn to support us. So we have a couple different things that we have going on right now. We have our golf tournament coming up in June the 10th. That's a Monday. And you can go to our events page to learn all about the different things that we have. Those are our two main ones, which is the golf tournament and our Passport to Cuba event. Both of those are wonderful opportunities to be able to meet other people who are also interested in helping in Cuba in any way that they can, be it prayer, be it financial support, be it going themselves, be it providing resources in different ways, be it human resources or financial resources. There's just different ways that people can help support us. If you're interested in helping us to spread the news about our ministry, we have what's called a Cuba Coffee Hour, and we'll actually have our executive director, who is Cuban, come to your house with your small group, be able to share and enjoy Cuba coffee while he tells you all about the ministry and the many things that God is doing there and how you can actually be a part of that as well. So we invite you all to explore the website, which is www.proclaimcuba.org. And Caroline is actually the one who put that website into place. So we're very grateful for her on that. Caroline, thanks for being with us today. Thanks for sharing your story. Thank you for encouraging others to go and to learn more about embracing Cuba this year in 2024. So look forward to continuing to work with you and doing many more podcasts together. All right?
Absolutely. Dios te bendiga, everyone.